For you. My first story takes place here in Alberta in the mountains. There was a group of friends who had spent the week camping in the mountains. They'd had a fabulous week. They'd been camping, hiking, a little bit of kayaking, all sorts of fun. In fact, they'd had so much fun that they hadn't wanted it to end, so they hadn't packed up very early. So just as the sun was setting, they were leaving the campground for the 4-hour drive back to the city. They weren't too concerned about this because they knew the route really well. They knew the way home and they had a cell phone. They weren't too concerned. So they got on the road and were having a nice drive home. A couple hours into the drive, Gina noticed a strange glow on the horizon. Joe, always the prankster, joked that it must be a UFO. The group laughed, certain that it was no such thing. And Melissa, always the practical one, suggested that perhaps they should just wait till they were a little further down the road and then they could see what this glow was. They continued on the way, and as they got closer they realized that the glow was just a sign, a diner sign, and in the foot of it, a lovely roadside diner. None of the group remembered a diner being there before. Must be new. Chris, always hungry, suggested that they should stop since they had skipped supper. And the group agreed a break would be fine about now. So they pulled in and took a look around. Oh, this thing is totally retro, Melissa exclaimed. It is, said Gina. It could be off of that show Happy Days. The group had a good laugh as they looked around at the black and white floor, the shiny counter with its 6 stools, booths along both sides with vinyl in red, complete with napkin dispensers and a jukebox against one wall. The group decided to sit at one of the booths because they could all sit together, and they picked the one that looked out at the road so they could watch the traffic going by. They settled in and waited. Soon, through the swinging doors, came a waitress. The group nearly gasped. As perfect as the diner was, the waitress's uniform was perfect. Every detail, from the apron with a ruffle to the little cap on her head. As she came up, she's snapping her gum in her mouth. "What'll I get you?" she said. The group kind of looked and decided that it was retro. They would go with retro diner food. Melissa ordered the fries and gravy. Gina ordered pie a la mode, complete with cherry coke. Chris and Joe agreed that a double cheeseburger would be the perfect food to enjoy in this setting. The waitress, whose name tag read Vera, licked her pencil and wrote their orders on the notepad. Every detail was perfect. They were flabbergasted as she headed back towards the kitchen. As they waited for their food, they discussed the fun week they'd had and the week that they had ahead at work, which was not sounding quite as fun. Quickly, Vera was back with their food, slapping dishes down on the table any which way. The group was a little taken aback by her manners as she stomped back to the counter, but quickly agreed that the food itself was impeccable. It was amazing. Best stuff they'd had in ages. The presentation, the waitress, may not have been the best, but the food was incredible. They enjoyed every bite, nibbling off of each other's plate, sharing, having a great time. In fact, they had such a great time that no one really wanted to leave. They lingered over those last few bites, till finally, with a reluctant sigh, Joe suggested that they needed to get back on the road. Melissa said, "You know what, guys? I'll get this one." So she headed up to the counter to pay. Vera looked up from the magazine that she was flipping through. "Ready to go?" Melissa said, "Yeah. Can I get the bill?" Vera said, "Let me just make sure. 2 double cheeseburgers, fries and gravy, pie a la mode, and a cherry coke?" "Yes," said Melissa, "that's what we had." "It'll be $5.55, said Vera. Melissa was taken aback. "Really? $5.55? "Yeah," said Vera, "I know, prices have gone up. You should have checked before you ordered. But it's $5.55. Melissa gave Vera a $10 bill and headed out of the diner to find her friends. You guys are not going to believe it. They had retro pricing to go with the retro food. The group was amazed, chatted about their wonderful experience, and continued on their drive home. A few days later, Melissa was chatting with one of her coworkers, describing their wonderful meal that they'd had to end their trip. The cool retro diner, the cool prices, everything. Her friend, who was from the area, stopped and looked at her. "Really? What did you say the name of the diner was?" Melissa said, "I think it was something like Red's Diner. I don't know." Her friend was like, "That's really strange. That sounds just like the diner my grandparents met at for their first date." But it couldn't be. That diner burnt down 50 years ago with their friend who was a waitress there. What was her name? Her name was Vera, I remember. Grandma used to say Vera would have died for that place. And I guess, well, in some ways she did. Melissa was shocked and didn't know what to think. Our waitress's name was Vera too. Her and her friend just looked at each other. Neither knew what to make. My second story takes place here in the city, in a tall apartment building, the type that's so big that it has 2 elevators, 2 doors, and many people. Mrs. Hunt lived there. Mrs. Hunt was a sweet elderly lady. She didn't love the fact that no one seems to know their neighbors anymore. In fact, most people were always behind their locked doors. But every day she would take her elevator ride and hope that she would meet one of her neighbors and get to have a lovely little conversation. Today was her lucky day. As she was coming into the elevator and pushing the button for the 17th floor, a man came into the elevator. He pushed the button for the 12th floor. "You're going to the 12th floor?" she exclaimed. The man, though, didn't say anything. She was not deterred. She was going to have a conversation with him. "It's lovely weather we're having. I prefer to use this elevator, even though most people prefer to use the south elevator." The man didn't say anything. Mrs. Hunt was a little disgruntled, but she was going to have a conversation with him. "If you don't mind," she said, "do you live here in the building, or are you just visiting someone?" She figured a question. He would have to answer a question. The man stared straight ahead at the doors, not acknowledging her at all. Mrs. Hunt huffed. "Excuse me," she said. "It's lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" Still nothing. And at that moment, the light lit up for the 12th floor. The man stepped through the doors. Mrs. Hunt was baffled. And then she remembered a conversation she had overheard some of her neighbors having. The one woman had whispered to the other woman about how she didn't like to use the north elevator because it was haunted. Mrs. Hunt felt a chill. She wasn't sure. Was that what had happened? Had she just met the resident ghost? She continued her ride. In the hall, Joseph King shook his shoulders and took a deep breath. He couldn't believe it. When he'd moved into the building, his neighbor had told him not to use the south elevator because it was haunted. Joseph King was a practical man. He didn't believe in such things as ghosts. But after today, he would never use that elevator again. Riding up 12 floors with that draft of cold air and that strange hazy glow meant he would never touch that elevator again.